Welcome everyone coming in. Welcome to Reimagine, and welcome to Past and Present with Allison Gilbert and guests. My name is Andrew Engel. I am Senior Programmer at Reimagine. Our mission is to help people of all backgrounds face adversity, loss, and mortality, and channel the hard parts of life into meaningful action and growth. For Grief is the sponsor of this series. Their support for Past and Present is so appreciated by all of us at Reimagine, and I know Allison is equally grateful. I have only one Zoom tip for you today. It's the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. If you click it, you'll get captions for everything that's being said if you need it. The majority of us are zooming in from the United States, also known as Turtle Island by Native Americans and their allies. I'm in Lenapehoking, and so is Christina and Allison. And this is where a large city called New York sits on occupied land. I ask you to join me in acknowledging Indigenous communities in North America, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. I'm stating this because it's a step, and hopefully more than just a gesture, to continue the process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. I'm very interested in knowing where all of you are from, so please put that in the chat. And there's a very helpful map called native-land.ca, and Christina can put that in the chat. And you can check that out to learn about the location of Indigenous people, past, present, and future. Mark your calendars for the next Past and Present on November 10th. The theme is Happiness Habits to help you find joy this holiday season. And Allison's special guest is writer, podcaster, entrepreneur, and happiness expert, Gretchen Rubin, and you can register for that in the link. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Allison. Allison Gilbert is the author of numerous books, and her new one, which you can see copies of behind her, is Listen World, the new biography of Hearst newspaper columnist Elsie Robinson. Her previous book, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, reveals creative ways to remember family and friends we never want to forget. You can learn about Allison's books and keep up with her on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. She's everywhere as A. Gilbert Writer. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Allison.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's always a pleasure to be here. I come to you every month, the last Thursday of the month. The only time that it changes is in November and December when the holidays are upon us. We adjust the calendar just slightly so we don't lose the momentum of this monthly series. And I am always looking forward to today. I feel that this gives us a pause in our busy lives to focus on what is so essential. Loss and death, and how we incorporate that into everything else that we have going on, whether it's work or parenting or other relationships that of course get impacted by loss. And I must start this month's conversation before I introduce Professor Sara Seager, who I know everyone is here to listen to her wisdom. I get it, but I have to start with something very personal this month, is that I have been living this life of loss and investing in what the future holds and loss at the same time. My book just came out, like Andy discussed, and at the same time, During my book tour, my beloved mother-in-law, a woman I've known since I was 18 years old, suffered a massive stroke and within days passed away. I put my book tour on hold because I needed to focus, of course, on my family. And it just made me think yet again how lucky I am to have this time to speak with preeminent experts about grief and loss like Professor Seager, who can bring her experience to bear in ways that perhaps we are unfamiliar. So Professor Seager, I know you are joining us. Your background, I admitted to you before we started, was giving me a little bit of a rash because I am not a scientist and I am not a mathematician, but I appreciate your expertise so much. And I assume you're coming to us from the campus of MIT.
That's right. Hi, everyone. I'm definitely on the MIT campus. And the blackboard behind me may just look like scribbles, but it is math that we use to describe my field of research.
Well, we are going to get into that. You are an astrophysicist. You are a professor of physics. You are a professor of planetary science, a professor of aeronautics and astronautics, I should say, at the institution MIT, which we just talked about. But the reason why you are here today specifically is that in addition to those accolades, you are also the author of a book that I could not put down. It was a remarkable memoir. It is called, as you have all seen in the introductory materials and the links, I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. The Smallest Lights in the Universe. So I want to start there, just at the title, before we go into why you wrote the memoir, and I will go into your personal story, of course. But what are the smallest lights in the universe? What does that mean?
It means two things. At face value, the smallest lights refer to, looking out at the night sky, not with our eyes, but imagine powerful telescopes. In our search for planets beyond Earth, every star is a sun. And we astronomers have discovered thousands of planets, and that each of those stars that are suns have planets. And the smallest lights are the ones we most seek, other Earths, true Earth twins somewhere out there in our galaxy. We can't find them yet, but we're hoping to. And the book, it's about the journey of exploring outer space, but it's also about the journey that we're all on of exploring our inner space. And the smallest lights in the universe also refer to, I'm assuming people are here because they've been there when you're really at the rock bottom, like you've fallen off the cliff and you're in that really deep, dark hole. There's always something to hold on to for hope. We each have that. And those are the smallest lights in the universe, the hope that's going to get you through.
I'm so taken by your message. We've been doing these past and present conversation events for quite some time, and your voice is unique, and which is why I so wanted to speak with you. But not only does it come from a place of science and rigor when it comes to your research, I should say, by the way, that you occupy incredible rare air. You have won a MacArthur Genius Grant for your work. It's so exceptional, but your personal story, when it comes to grief, starts when you were, I believe, 40, and your husband suddenly died. Can you take us to that time?
I can. I was one of those, am at the time. Looking back, I had everything. I had my amazing career being an MIT professor. I had two beautiful toddlers. My dream house, which is an old Victorian. It's a dream until you actually start living in it. Because so old, everything's falling apart. I had my cats. When I look back, it was, wow, a great life. And just I was motoring along, working hard. My husband, by the way, worked part-time to support my ambitious career when he got a stomach ache that wouldn't go away. And I think everyone here, hopefully you know that when you have a problem, you really need to advocate strongly for yourself or your loved ones, because the doctors just told him it was nothing. Well, the last time I knew someone with a stomach ache that wouldn't go away was my dad, who died of pancreatic cancer a couple months later. So I was never the nag, but eventually things went from bad to worse. And he had a complete intestinal blockage, went to the hospital. Maybe some of you share my story, but whenever I know some of us, we've had the breast cancer scare, or you've had breast cancer, or your family has had a scare, but you can go from like the test and maybe you off ramp in a good way, or you can have what my husband had, where at every junction, it's the worst case scenario. So he had this intestinal blockage. It could have been nothing. It could have been cancer that hadn't spread, that was like a sausage. You could chop that part of the intestine out and he'd be fine without even any chemotherapy. But at every juncture, it was the worst possible scenario until he got the surgery. The cancer had spread and he was just given years to live, which clearly wasn't what happened, but he died about a year and a half after he was diagnosed. And it was a tough, tough road for us. I went from being that ambitious working mom to being like a caretaker and to helping him in his final journey.
You mentioned your two children. Their names are Max and Alex. And I'm wondering, of course, there are many parts of this story to talk about, but one of them, of course, is being a mother to two children whose father was sick. And I'm wondering what that was like for you.
Right. And just so everyone knows, I'm like 10 or 12 years out. So I feel good now. I can cry anytime when I, think about certain things, but so it may seem like I'm happy, but I have some very funny stories for you. So on the whole, though, I let them be my guide. I didn't like read a book or figure it out. I kind of followed them. And one thing I learned that's amazing is that kids, perhaps throughout like centuries, millennia that humans have been around, they're never told anything directly. So if I sat them down to tell them some news, they wouldn't listen. They ran off. They're like, I don't want to know. But they're used to eavesdropping. So if I had to convey something important to them, I would be, let's say you were at my house, Allison, I'd be, Allison, I have something very important to tell you right now. And they'd be like right beside me, And so it's like, Allison, I have to update you on Mike. He's at this juncture now that's not looking good. And so as soon as I did that, then they would run off and play. And then I could get to the nitty gritty with you. So I had to find a way to let them know what was happening without telling them directly, because they didn't really want to know. And sometimes I would just take their temperature to see where they're at. So one time we were having dinner and Mike had managed to come downstairs from where he was usually cooped up in his bed. He looked around, didn't eat anything. He just said, I have a huge headache. And he put his head down, dozed off for a moment, looked up, and then left. And I just said, I know you'll find it sad, but looking back again, like over a decade, it just makes me laugh. I just said, so boys, is your dad normal or is he sick? And I just said it in that voice because I didn't know what they're thinking. They looked at each other without speaking, said in unison, normal. And I was like, wow, okay. That makes perfect sense, actually, because kids have short attention spans. I mean, they don't think back years and years, and they were only age 5 and 7 at the time, right? So like if that's how he had been for a few weeks or a month or 2 or 3, like that's their dad. I was like, okay. But I didn't like get mad or cry or go, no, that's not. I just kind of just let them be the guide. I was like, okay. And we just carried on eating, and that was that.
What I love about what you're describing is you met your children developmentally, it seems like, where they were and what they could handle and how you as a mother thought they can best digest
right
what was happening.
And it got to the point where, I really thought through everything as carefully as possible. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to tell them someday that he's dying. And I don't want to tell them too far in advance because that'll just, there's no point in that. But I obviously don't want to tell them like right the day before. So when is it? So kind of kept my eye on things. It ended up being, I want to say about 6 weeks before he died. And we were going on an outing to the zoo in Rhode Island, and we were taking the train, and I had them like cornered. So I started to lay it out to them, because what you have to do, you all, if you've been through grief, know this, you can't just drop it. You got to kind of let them come to their conclusion. So it's like, well, boys, I just want you to know that someone in our family is really sick. The medicine's not working. I'm just, so I kind of laid it out like that. I'm like, I'm really sorry to tell you that this person, they're not going to make it, and it's your dad. And one of them was like, I already knew that. The older one, he had kind of figured that out from the eavesdropping. I tried to drop enough hints along the way. And the younger one's like, what? I thought you were talking about Minnie May. That was our cat at the time. It was really old. So it was just so hard. Like, imagine having to tell your kids who are so young and innocent. Definitely hard, actually. And I'll just drop one more thing and then we can move on. The other really hard thing that comes to mind is, at one point I was like, it's time. I mean, this is the type of thing I'll cry over, but it's like time to say goodbye. And one of them, he was just so sweet. And the other one's like, I'm not listening. I can't, and we're going to force him, because the goodbye is so slow, when someone slips away. It's not just usually like an instant. It's sort of over time, him being sick, him sleeping at the table, him like that. It was definitely a hard path.
There are two things that come up for me as I'm listening to you. One is that it is so important, and you've nailed it, to meet children where they are, yet never to lie to them. In my experience being on the board, a former board member of the National Alliance for Children's Grief, you might have death and grief laid out like a banquet, and you may pick and choose the food that you eat, and you kind of eat slowly based on your hunger level at a certain time. It doesn't mean that you are completely blocking from view everything that's on that banquet table. You're certainly not saying to someone that that chocolate cake doesn't exist. It's just you haven't gotten there yet. And the one thing that the National Alliance for Children's Grief, NACG, if you need that resource would say, is that give out information in age-appropriate nuggets, but never lie. And I find to listen to your story to hearken back to the very best research we have on that. The other thing that I was thinking about, Sarah, when you were talking, it's a little bit different, but similar, is that after both of my parents passed away, and I wanted to make sure that my children were remembering their grandparents and having some sort of connection to who their maternal grandfather was and their maternal grandmother, who they never met, was. I wanted them to understand their traits that they may have inherited from the grandparents they never got to know. I use social media to my advantage in much the same way that you talked to a friend, but with your kids within earshot. And what I mean by that is I might have posted something about my dad or about my mom, but the intended audience were not my Facebook friends or my Instagram friends. I knew my teenage kids were on Instagram, and that they would then see what I would have to say about their grandparents. And so it's similar to what you're saying, I think. And I wanted to go on to my next part of this discussion with you, is that there was a wonderful New York Times article written about you. There's so much press on you, Professor Seager, and that after the loss of your husband, I believe the anecdote is that you were taking your boys sledding in the snow, and you had said something like that you felt ugly and ruined next to the seemingly more buoyant moms at that time, or the parents who were seemingly effortlessly engaging in this snow time activity with their children, that by comparison, you felt ugly and ruined and just depleted. And what was that low moment like for you? And how did you begin digging your way out?
That's a great question. I would ask people if they feel comfortable raising their hand. How many of you had had a major meltdown in public?
No.
Okay, it is so humiliating but it happens over and over again because you're so depleted. You have no reserves. It's like being broke, but emotionally. I had one friend at the time, and I had a big, massive fight with him the night before. And I just woke up, and with little kids, you're up at dawn, whatever, early. And I was just so depressed. And I was taking my kids sledding, and there wasn't quite enough snow. So one of them kept getting stuck, and he was melting down because he couldn't get down. And there are these other two moms, so beautiful, radiant. One had a ton of makeup on. I was like, who puts that level of makeup on a Sunday morning, So
Yeah.
she looked really good.
Not me. Yeah, not me either.
Not when you're dragging yourself out of bed. And the other mom was so happy and bright. And there were only two other moms there. And they're like, oh, could you move your son? He's blocking the hill. And, they said it in the nicest way possible. But I was like, excuse me? And I just didn't respond until they kept asking. And then finally, instead of saying, let me move him, I just had the massive meltdown. And I'm like, my husband died. And I'm like screaming. And like normally, you'd have like a little warm up before you get to that. It was just absolutely insane. And one of them walked over to me and was like, mine too. As if it was like the most cheery party you could have been to. Meanwhile, I was super depressed. That just made me feel worse, actually, because she was so beautiful and happy. I was happy about that kind of stuff. But she meant she was happy because she could help me somehow. And I just couldn't. And eventually what I did was, it's the so-called electronic babysitter. I rushed home with the two kids, grabbed the iPad that was new. We just got it, went back. So one kid, the one who was melting down, could use the iPad in the car while the other one could keep sledding. So I got back and I was hoping they'd be gone, because who wants to see someone after you've just melted down like that? And she walked over to me like as if I'm some kind of, wounded animal. And she gave me a piece of paper that had her name and her number on it. And she's like, well, we just started a group of widows. And this lady's about my age. I'd already called the church to join a widows group, but they said I couldn't join because it was for older ladies, not young people with kids. And this woman's like, and just being the scientist that I am, my mind went to immediately, that's impossible. Because our town has 20,000 people. How could there be, 6 or 7 widows? Just makes no sense. Obviously, I didn't do the math, but just thinking through that. Yeah, and she just didn't say anything. By then she knew not to say a thing, right? Just walked away. And I had that piece of paper and I was like, I couldn't even process it. My brain was just in a knot. And I just want to fast forward a little bit. Yeah, it was like a remarkable thing. And I am one of those people, though, who seizes opportunity. Like that's one of the secrets to success. And just amazing that she told me they were meeting on Valentine's Day. I went to that party and Melissa, it's now 10 or 12 years later, remains my best friend. That lady who was radiant, the one without makeup, super beautiful lady, no makeup, just glowing from the inside, age 60 now, turned 60. Oh no, she's turning 60. Yeah, a crazy life.
I want to talk about that group. From my understanding, and tell me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, because I'm in New York, you're up in Massachusetts. It's the Widows of Concord, right? Am I pronouncing Concord correctly?
Concord, correct.
Concord. Right. And that support group is what you're referencing, right?
Right.
And so I want to talk about, it seems to be that you derived great comfort from looking to the stars, that there was a compass that you could navigate in your scientific brain. There was an order to what you were researching, I think, or you were trying to make order through your research of what you were seeing. And then there was this disorder that you were experiencing on Earth that somehow, and tell me where I go wrong, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it strikes me that something about this Widows of Concord group helped you create order out of this chaos. You had said in that Times article, dinner making felt impossible. School lunches felt overwhelming to prep for your boys, Max and Alex. The roof needed to be replaced and you didn't know where to begin. It felt overwhelming. And I'm wondering, what kind of order did a support group allow you to start framing that could help?
Well, the first thing is, when you're grieving, of course, you feel so isolated. There is a stigma in society and people don't want to talk to you about it. Maybe they're afraid they might go through it someday as if it's somehow contagious. They don't want to say the wrong thing. And so you basically have nothing, nothing. Most of your regular friends, just maybe you're lucky, but they just can't handle this. So the first thing was just having other peers. Everyone in this group had children. There were so many children. Every kid had someone of the same age and gender. And they were also really helpful with practical problems. And they could help solve problems. They could come over to my house and show me around, show me what I needed to pay attention to. So there's definitely some order. And there was definitely a lot of laughing and crying.
I find that support groups are sometimes, and I think to some people, even more helpful than your own family. And what I mean by that is, and I say it from personal experience, is that I have an older brother, and he and I lost the same mother and we lost the same father. And it does not mean we grieved in any way, shape, or form in the same way. And that the comfort I derived by having people opt into a support group who wanted to talk, who wanted to share ideas that would help them on the road to finding comfort. Those were strangers at the beginning, but ultimately became so important to my healing process. And it's not to discount that, of course, I have a brother who I love. It just wasn't what I needed. His type of approach was so different than mine. I'm emotive, he's cerebral. I need to think about the birthday of my parents and the anniversary of their death. He didn't need to have the calendar to remind him of his voids. And I wonder if you can talk about that too, of finding comfort in a room full of what begins as strangers.
It's so comforting. I think you've said it really well. I don't know that I have anything to add. It's just, yeah, so great.
What made you want to write a book? You come from a world of science, not to say that scientists can't be writers, but I'm assuming that the writing that many scientists do are for academic journals or other types of publications and not necessarily literary memoirs. And your book was really praised as just being beautifully written. And I can attest to that because I so enjoyed it. What made you want to write a memoir?
Well, it started out after I was with this widows group for a while. It was pretty clear how crazy the life is of a widow with kids. I mean, you're pretty much scrambling all the time. I mean, not to say that's not true of other moms. Everyone's always scrambling, but there was like this certain like dark humor. There was a very unusual way of living. And I approached my group and I was like, isn't someone going to write about this? Because it's just the intensification, the intensified grief, the kind of coming alive again. There's some beauty to the story, but also a lot of depressing things. And they said, no, someone wanted to write a book, but they felt too, because we're a privileged group of women, we didn't lose our kids over this or have to move back to our hometown and have our kids live somewhere else with the grandparents. And that most of these women didn't work actually, because they had plenty of money, whether that was life insurance or just family money. And people couldn't really quite figure out how could we write about this in a way that helped other people. I mean, I thought they should also have a guidebook, how to do this, how to do that, how to get your husband's name off stuff. Even years later, I'd still get mail for him or couldn't get his name off a bank account, or just practical things, like lots of things. So I'd always wanted to kind of do that. And it's very cathartic to like put all your feelings on paper. And then after that, the book just evolved into a longer memoir connecting science and personal.
I wonder if we can address one more question that I have after I pause for this brief announcement, is that I'm looking at the clock and it's 1 minute to 1:30 here Eastern time, which means it's almost time for me to turn my attention to the chat. Christina, who is on this call, is always helping me. If you join us, there she is. If you join us month to month, you will know that I asked Christina to go through the chat so Sara and I can keep the conversation going. But while you are thinking about what you may want to ask Professor Seager, I encourage you are here for a reason. There is something about Professor Seager that grabbed you likely as it has grabbed me, her work and her words and her experiences. So this is your time to ask her anything that you would want. Some of the questions that you can ask Professor Seager, of course, is about work as an escape. She has talked about that. You can speak with her about being a mom to two young boys who have now growing up without their dad. You can talk to her about being a widow and missing your partner, of course. And you can also ask her questions that may be unfamiliar, at least when you started this call, which is, what is her relationship between the stars and the earth and finding healing? And so there are lots of things you can talk to Professor Seager about. So I invite you, as I go through my one question that I have left before I turn it over to you and your questions, please put your questions in the chat. I encourage you to take advantage of this time. And without further ado, to my last question, it goes to that work question that I was kind of teasing folks about just a few seconds ago, is that you did find work to be an escape. What does that mean for you? What did that look like?
Well, one of the things it's related to that we haven't touched on yet is hope. And, when my husband died, I just, life lost meaning, just making dinner. No, I never made dinner. I went to my book club, and they're the things they were talking about, I just couldn't relate to any of them. They were arguing about who's picking up the kids or taking out the trash or whatever. And all the daily stuff just became ant noise. That's what Melissa calls it, just a lot of stuff. And like something so huge happened to me. How do I go on living unless I can contribute to some larger purpose? And so I went to my work and I was like, what can I do that might have impact? And so I took that kind of hope and folded that into my job. So it was partly an escape, but it was partly to find meaning in life again. Want something that meaningful, or you lose something so meaningful, you have to kind of reorient. So having to get up in the morning and get out of the house, that was really helpful, just from a plain, logistical viewpoint. I didn't have time, although I kind of, looking back, maybe I needed to just lie on the couch and do nothing and be cathartically crying all day, because I know people who did that. But for someone like me, it was just better to have to go somewhere, it forces you to kind of just keep moving forward. But folding that into hope and thinking of what's out there and how to help us astronomers and us humans understand better, where did we come from? Are we alone? What's out there? It gave me a new purpose.
I have to ask you this, when you say what's out there, do you have any evidence that your husband is out there? Have you had connection to him? Do you believe in life after death?
I don't. Unfortunately, I do not believe in life after death. When I was a child growing up, my dad believed in reincarnation, and he believed that he and I would always be together, that we would come in another life, either maybe husband and wife, maybe business partners or brothers. I was very attached to my dad. So when he died, it was just an incredible blow. But one of the reasons I became a scientist, I think I was just naturally skeptical. And so even when he first told me that, I was about 11 or 12, I went to the library and I read all the books I could on reincarnation. But I personally don't believe in life after death. And I haven't seen any signs of my husband. Sometimes I try not to go there, but people sometimes I like to pretend I've seen him. Or one time we were hiking, and there, oddly enough, one of the kids pointed out, this man looked just like Mike, honestly, unbelievably like him. And he was with a woman. They were younger, that might have resembled me. And this person, for whatever reason, came up and started asking me questions like, oh, what's the best way down? And I might want to pretend, it's sometimes a bit dangerous to do this. After we left and we kept hiking, so we were at the top of Lafayette, this really hard mountain to climb in New Hampshire. I would want to sort of imagine wow, that was Mike checking up on me and making sure we're all okay. It's just so sad. But I definitely, once in a while, some people go there a lot. Others of us, we just try not to. So I don't believe in life after death, but I can't say I don't toy, with the fact that that example I just gave you.
I appreciate you letting me ask that question. It seemed like it was just a quick on my mind after you had said that last statement. So I hope you don't mind me asking.
No, not at all. Yeah.
Christina, I'm going to bring you in at this point. It's 1:35 here Eastern. I want to leave time for questions for Professor Seager. If people have questions, of course, for me too, I would love to be able to answer them, of course. And so, Christina, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Okay, our first question is, how did you manage work how did you manage work and taking care of your husband when he was sick and managing that stress?
Well, that's a great question. And in my case, just, the interest of full disclosure, remember I told you he got diagnosed and then he died 18 months later, and he was only really sick for probably 4 months. So although it was incredibly stressful and yes, pretty much impossible to keep all the balls in the air, I only had 4 months to do it. I can only imagine how hard it is for 8 years. And I honestly think that unless you have a lot of money or a lot of friends or family that can help, it's just like, I'm not surprised that it's so hard. It's so hard to keep it all going. You need some kind of help. And maybe someone else here can offer some more practical advice, but it's definitely, all I can do is empathize with you, sympathize that it's nearly impossible to keep all the balls in the air.
Yeah, in fact, if someone does have advice, you can raise your virtual hand. Perhaps Christina can look for that virtual hand and we can come back to you after the next question. It's always great to have this be an interactive discussion. So Christina, keep your eye out for that hand and go on to the next question.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I can just jump in with the next question. That comes from Andy actually about the environment. Like it's a bit, maybe you might take this as maybe a negative, but when we think about the universe, it's so vast. There are so many planets out there. There has to be life somewhere. And here on our own planet, if we end up self-destructing, like humans dying of disease and, we're overpopulated, our Earth will go on. Like you live in New York, I'm sure I don't know if you personally, but there are cockroaches, right? Probably in your apartment, there are rats. Do you think those things are going to survive? Of course they are. So it may seem disheartening, but somehow it's heartening on the other side that life will go on, no matter what happens to us humans. So that's one way, thinking of our own Earth as being very resilient in and of itself, and also thinking of all the life forms and all the planets that must be out there. It may not give us all hope, but it gives me hope, makes me feel a bit better about everything.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Carol. She says, could Professor Seager speak more about the relationship between the night sky / astronomy and grieving and healing?
One thing is when you're deep in grief, everything's just awful. The world is black and white, food tastes horrible, everything's just sad. And then after a while, you start getting these little islands of either happiness, just for maybe a few seconds here, or you just see the way the light shines on the water. And there's just something that gives you like that little good feeling. And soon those feelings can grow to like encompass more of your time. So for me personally, that's what the night sky does. Whenever I step outside of my house, I always just look up. This morning, it was really dark when I left for work, and I saw the constellation Orion. I saw the Big Dipper. I think in New York too, right? It's very clear now. And did you just have all that rain and fog the last 2 days? And all of a sudden, right, it just got really windy and so for me, when I look at that, it's that aesthetic that you may find just in the forest outside or in a certain architecture of a building or the way the light falls. And for me, that's looking at the sky and seeing that beauty that gives me hope. And it's also what I already said about how the universe is so vast that somewhere out there, there is life thriving, no matter what is happening here to me in my own like little individual world.
What came up for me as you were just talking, there are two things. One, there's been a lot of research done about being in nature and how that is incredibly restorative. And the reason is that throughout our lives, or at least one reason why that is that throughout our lives, there's so much pulling at our attention and we're so busy and, there's so many demands on our beings, right? From our work to our kids, to our partners, to just, keeping the rent being paid or their mortgage being paid. But nature, when you go outside and you look at the stars or you look down at the water, whatever it is, it demands nothing of us. It's just there for the taking. It's free. There's no give and take. There's no bartering. You can take it in, you can reap the benefits, and it demands nothing of us in return. So that's one reason why researchers have said that nature is so restorative. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that it's on my mind because I just released this book about Elsie Robinson, who is a writer that no one remembers, but she became the highest paid writer in the William Randolph Hearst empire. And she suffered a lot of loss in her life. And she had said that nature is what got her through, is that nature became a light that allowed her to navigate her pain and provided relief. And so I appreciate so much of what you're saying. And my question back to you is there anything about size and scale that's part of this? That when you look out to the stars and you feel relatively small, is that perspective somehow useful to us to know that we are not, our problems are not as big maybe as we?
I'd say, yeah, I'd give that a yes and a no. I mean, sometimes it made me angry that we're just this tiny little speck on our planet. And each one of us, maybe we're just like an ant to some higher being that hasn't, it made me really upset though, because my life is me, right? And we get so angry and upset, but to the universe, no one else cares. The whole universe out there, whatever those other stars, planets, any intelligent life. So on the one hand, it can be angering, but on the other hand, it is very consoling in some way that life will go on, time will go on. And there's such a vastness out there that things can still be at peace somewhere else.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina.
The next question is an anonymous question. It says, because I lost my husband so young, I get a lot of, you're so young, you'll meet someone else comments. Do you have advice on how to handle these inappropriate and hurtful comments?
Wow, we all have so many inappropriate comments. Those of us who grieved or are grieving, people just say the wrong thing. I mean, it just depends how you want to handle this. Like, you can think of something snappy that makes sure they never say that again, or maybe you just want to let it slide. I mean, I really think it just depends on the other person. I had so many bad things people would say. I had people come up to me and go, oh my God, I'd have no idea what would happen to me if my wife had died. It's like, oh, thanks. So I think you just have to, if it's someone you know well, you could say that's just really inappropriate. Or, you could just let it slide. But there's one thing we hadn't got to. And I think this is part of, I actually think this is part of Allison's whole take on everything, that I saw grief. It's like the dinosaurs, like a big meteorite hit our planet and eventually killed off all the dinosaurs. But because all those dinosaurs died, there was room for something new to flourish. And sometimes when you do have like grief, it's a major catastrophe. And in some cases, it allows you to have there's post-traumatic stress, but there's also post-traumatic growth. And one thing I just told this, I don't think this came out in the book the way I wanted it to. It kind of didn't quite come out, but I tried to convey, even despite being depressed and unhappy, I tried to be positive about things. And one little mantra I always gave myself was, I will be happy again someday. I will be fine one day. And I also threw a little thing there about a partner, because I was like, I remember the early days with my husband, Mike, felt at the time like the best times of my life, just so happy and carefree. And I would just say to myself, someday I will, I don't know if I said may or will, which is the difference, but I will have another best friend and I will be as happy again. I just literally say that to myself, thinking of, not like I have to get married again. That was not necessarily what I was thinking, but leaving room for that and convincing myself at my core to be open to that possibility. And I just said that like every day. And I did one of the things, I don't want to now come across like I am the person like that, but my best friend, Melissa, she took me aside and she's like, you have to start dating again. And I was like, no, I don't. But that was my best friend. So I could tell her back that that's just not going to happen. And what she explained to me that I now believe is that in order to heal, you have to explore all the corners of grief. Because there's triggers, like you'll go somewhere and it suddenly reminds you of the person who died, and then you get all upset again. You have to like check all those corners, no matter how painful it is. And she explained to me, and this is for the young widows, like to date again, it doesn't matter because it's not going to work out the first time, but you go out with a person, all you want to do is cry because it just reminds you how much you miss your husband or your partner. And you just have to do that because you're exploring those corners of grief and like airing it out and getting it to heal. So I did do that a few times and it was a complete disaster. But one day I was at a conference, actually an astronomy conference. It was an amateur astronomy conference. And when I got there, a widow was hosting me, by the way, because they have to host you at people's houses because this place didn't have like a lot of money and it was far away. It was in Canada, where all the different astronomy centers belonging to this group get together once a year, or parts of the people do. And I got there and I spotted this man across the room. It was like the movies. I was like, wow, who is that man? I have to meet him. And it just was so like electric. And long story short, it took a while, but we are now married and I remarried. And my husband, Charles, I don't want to, it's like a bit of a spoiler now for the book, but he adopted the boys. And it's on the whole been amazing. It definitely comes with its own baggage, but I'd just say at large, it was really good. So I gave you like a long rambling answer to that. So the first thing is, depending on who it is and how angry you are, you can say something that makes that person like never dare say that again, or you can let it slide. But there's also this thing, if you are indeed a young widow, I just want to channel Melissa and say, just try to date, no matter how hard it is, just so if you ever do come across someone later, you'll be ready for that person. You'll have gotten through those memories and triggering that grief and just, getting it over with.
This may sound like a very odd question, but how much of Mike is in your marriage today?
Yeah, that is definitely a sticking point. I know a lot of widows and other people handle it differently, but it's a really touchy topic, actually. And we've done our best, like out of respect for my new husband. I usually don't talk about that because, it's a little tricky.
Of course.
So I'd say he's basically not there. I've done my best to like keep him away. And this might sound, I don't want this to come out the wrong way for everyone. And it is in the book. So like you'll read the book, you'll hear it. You'll just hear it from me in person. But right before I got married, I realized I was still hanging on to Mike. Of course I am. Of course we all are, because that person is part of you. And I, just like your parents or whoever in your life you're grieving for, part of you dies with that person. And a part of that person lives on with you. And so I had to break up with my husband, the dead one, because I couldn't bring him into the marriage. I'm like, I don't want to have like him hanging over there all the time. It was really hard because I haven't ever been divorced, but obviously, not obviously, like I've broken up with people or they've broken up with me. So like things have to end. And so I just had to like imagine like meeting him and breaking up with him. And I dreamed about him a lot. I still sometimes dream about him. But and in my dreams, eventually we weren't married anymore. It's like I purposely tried to make it so that I could, you can never get over or finish those. We all know those things don't happen. But I definitely had to try to make like this separation so that he wouldn't always be around.
Thank you for being so candid. I hope that everyone here listening even appreciates that when I prepare for these conversations, I do not give the folks who I'm interviewing a heads up to what I'm asking. My job, I hope, is to ask the questions that may be on your mind that could help you on your healing journey. So I appreciate, Professor Seager, your willingness to even answer me as candidly as you have.
I do want to add one thing. So I used to have this picture of Mike in the living room holding one of the kids as a baby, and our dog was in the background. And what happened after a while was like, I want to remember Mike, but when I want to remember him, I don't want to think about him every time I see this picture of him staring out at us. And I sort of realized it was time to put the pictures away, actually. And I know I respect how everyone wants to do this. Some people, one of the widows I know who is repartnered, she has like his picture and his ashes like by her bedside. And she wants that. But for me, who I am, I'm like, I definitely want to still think about him, but just on my own terms, not every time I walk through my living room. So like the kids are around, and this was before I met my current husband. I was like, so everyone, are we ready to, in a voice suitable for a child? Hey, I was thinking of moving this picture now. Are you two ready for that? And one was like, okay, sure. And the other one, he just started looking really anxious, like blinking a lot and just kind of squirming. So I'd be like, okay, we'll just keep it here for a while. And so I did that like every 3 months or so, because I was really ready to move that picture and put it in the closet. And eventually everybody was ready, and they were like, okay, yeah, we're ready to put that picture away. And so we can all think about him, on our own terms. And I think that was part of that process of moving towards being ready for meeting my new husband, or just being ready to not have him always there, because I know it's easy to fall in that habit of just always having that person around.
I love the fact that you have said two things that I think are worth highlighting. One is that you allowed your children to have a voice and a say, and you didn't just move things without their input. That honors their grief. And so I just want to just acknowledge that and give it a shout out and a thumbs up. And I love it. As someone who was on the board of the NACG, that's like textbook perfect. And so thank you for giving voice to that. And number two, what I love is that too often people ask grief experts, am I doing grief right? And what you're describing is how you felt about a photograph. And that may not be the same as somebody else who's listening to this about a photograph, even your friend who kept the ashes by her bedside table. To let go of, am I doing this right? Is there a perfect way of grieving? To let that go is incredibly liberating. And I want to just announce that I love that too. And so thank you for being so candid. We have 8 minutes left. In terms of housekeeping, what I do want to say is that For Grief has a private, when I say private, it sounds like you have to be a certain person to enter. You have to just knock on the door and say, I want in, a private Facebook group that is a wonderful place to continue this conversation and others. We had talked during this Zoom today with Professor Seager about the power of being in community with others who have also suffered loss as being distinct and sometimes more helpful than relying on your own family. So if you do want to be in conversation with others who are bereaved, either last week or 5 years ago, or even 15 years ago, you understand my point. There is no time-bound limitation on this group. Join the For Grief community. All you have to do is ask to be entered, and that way your messages are kept in that private ecosystem, and you don't have to feel like your family will have access to that conversation if you don't want them to. And in the 7 minutes now we have left, I do want to ask Professor Seager another question before I toss it back to Christina, which is, do you feel in that hope space that we've talked about before that your particular profession, in terms of that, I mean, not many people can say, of course, that you are an astrophysicist or a professor of planetary science. And I'm wondering if you feel like you experienced grief and processed it differently because of your scientific bent, being comfortable with mathematics. Is there something to cerebral versus heart? How did that show up for you in the way that you processed loss?
Well, initially, I think we're all the same in the way we process initially. And with my widows group, it seemed everyone in the initial steps was similar, it's that shock, just how you're in your own world of sadness. I think that is, but I think the way I approached healing may have been a little, I'm autistic, by the way. So, the sort of logic, like after a while, I don't know, I was just pretty depressed and sad for like 2 or 3 years. But at some point, like the way I described the things I did with my kids, I had to think so carefully, and I did try to apply logic, like the example we started with of eavesdropping, I would logic it out. So I think all my initial steps would be very similar to a lot of people. But I think the later steps, I just sort of thought more logically about where am I going? Where am I at? How do I get out of this? How do I get my life to return somewhere? It's not that clear cut though, because it's muddled and sometimes overwhelmed with anger. I think anger was my biggest thing that remained, anger and grief.
What are you working on now in terms of your research? And is there any comfort you get from your current projects that you're working on?
Well, one thing that may appeal more to people is, so initially, during and right after grief, I didn't deal with crap. Like if someone wanted me to do something that was just super boring and tedious and a complete waste of time, whether that was a social event or a work event, I said no. And my logic being, I paid my dues it's like paying tax. I paid a lifetime of tax in irritation, in anger. Wasn't my fault. My husband died. I got dealt a bad hand of cards. You know what? I'm just saying no to everything I don't want to do anymore. And it allowed me to really focus on what I cared about. That I kind of lost a bit now. It's like 10, 12 years later. So I have to really hone that for work, because otherwise, just like everything, you just end up wasting time. Well, I've switched my focus to the planet Venus now, our sister planet, which has been really overlooked, like in any family, how one sibling always gets all the attention. That's Mars. One always gets ignored Venus. And through a convoluted path, we've discovered that in the Venus clouds, we've revived this old idea that there might be some kind of life floating around in the clouds. And I have a mission to Venus where we're going to not find life, at least not initially, but we're going to search for chemicals in the cloud particles that might mean the particles could support some kind of life. And these aren't water clouds. It's made of a very nasty chemical called sulfuric acid. So I'll leave it there. And hopefully as the future goes by, you can read more or learn more about this.
Well, how would folks learn more about your research? Because I'm fascinated by that.
You can go to my website, saraseager.com. We also have a website on Venus called venuscloudlife.com. And just generally Googling my name and news, and there's news articles that will pop up about Venus.
Do you have another book in you, do you think, Professor Seager?
That I'm not really sure, not right now. Maybe when I live another lifetime, half lifetime, there'll be more material.
Do you think in this climate of how the publishing industry is shifting, do you think your book would have found a publisher, or do you feel like you hit it at just the right time?
Oddly enough, there is this new genre of book, of memoir, and there are many scientists now writing books about intertwining their personal life with their work, actually. So I think we'll have to wait and see if this genre continues to be popular. It actually started with a book called Lab Girl, a woman who wrote this book about plants. And she talked about seedlings. And then the next chapter would be about her as a baby. Then she'd talk about the little plant as it grows, and then her. And that book was immensely popular. And then after that, books like mine and others kind of followed that. And so we'll see. I think that genre is still popular for now, but I don't know if it'll keep going or if it will wane. So I think I hit it at a good time.
Not putting you on the spot, perhaps it could be an email to me later that we can put in our note that goes along with this video. Can you think off the top of your head of some other books in the last minute we have left? If folks really want to dig into this genre a little bit further, we'd love to be able to give a shout out to those other scientists and writers.
Yep. One of them is called Lab Girl, Labgirl. I might have to, one of them is called A Portrait of the Scientist as a Young Woman.
Well, that sounds great. We will definitely make sure that in our thank you note to everyone in attendance today and those who registered and who could not come, get these ideas. And with 1 minute left, I am always on time. I don't want to waste a single second of Professor Seager's time with my phone ringing at home. I didn't take it off the hook. Oops. I want to thank everyone for your attention, and I can't wait until next month's conversation series. And I'm so grateful, Professor Seager, for your time. Andy and Reimagine, thank you. And of course, for grief, I am always so grateful that you provide this opportunity for all of us to gather. So thank you, everybody.